I don't want to make it too long. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Rick Iedema to talk to us. One of the huge advantages of doing online sessions is that we can have people from all over the world, and I don't think Rick needs much of an introduction. He was professor at the Center of Team-Based Practice at King's College in London, but has now returned to Australia and is speaking to us from, you said, 300 kilometers south of Sydney. So it's really good to have you here. Rick has widely published on organizational discourse and discourses of post-bureaucratic organization, communication in healthcare settings, and developed a sort of a new innovative methodology on video reflexive ethnography. And today he's going to talk about affects and discourses. So the floor is yours. I'm very much looking forward to the talk.
Thank you, Michael, Johannes, and Jaspal, although I know that Jaspal is not the person being Jaspal at the moment. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to talk. I mean, it's a nice reminder for me that it is important to contribute to academic discussion. And I say that because I left London late last year amidst the COVID and Brexit madness, and escaped back to Australia when I had the chance. And I am now where this little photo shows you, which is just down the road from where I am, a very quiet little place on the coast. I've always been interested in discourse and its relation to meaning. I suppose I use those terms interchangeably, and that's not quite right, of course, but I suppose meaning is a little bit more general than discourse. I prefer the term meaning in this particular talk because I do want to speak about discourse at a more general level. And I want to think about what happens when discourse comes up against its own limits. And, you know, I want to go there because personally I've experienced meaning or discourses coming up against their own limits, but socially and globally, we are experiencing the same kind of thing. COVID has presented us with a context that obliges us to make meaning of what's going on. The whole Ukraine conflict is another phenomenon, you know, that really verges into meaninglessness for me anyway. I do not know what to do with that. I do not know how to talk about that. I mean, there's a lot of people, of course, who will say that what is happening there is a manifestation of evil. And that, of course, is the conventional way of dealing with these kinds of novel situations where the new, the unexpected, either falls into the very good or the very bad. And I want to reflect on these things more along the lines of, these are novel things that present discourse and meaning more generally with a challenge. And that challenge is to mean in ways that can encapsulate what's going on. I also want to ask those questions because of what's happening in terms of knowledge and authority and science generally being challenged. And I don't say this regretfully, I'm just observing this factually. But I suppose these developments mean that there is something going on with how we mean. In the past, you could point to maybe hierarchy, you could point to faith, you could point to social status, etc., as mechanisms through which we would modulate our access to meaning and discourse. And these things seem to be much more up in the air at the moment. And that too then means that we are far more inclined and far more obliged to confront the limits of discourse and the limits of meaning. I have some slides that I'll use just to guide myself in what I'm saying. Please do stop me if at any point I say anything that you feel warrants a question or a comment. So I'm perfectly open to chatting with you as we go. We've got about an hour, so I will need to keep moving it along, but more than happy for you to interrupt. If we talk about discourse or meaning more generally, then I've recently begun to understand that as a process of making worlds, as worlding, as a process through which we envelop ourselves within spheres that provide protection and unity, communication, places of being, etc. Of course, you know, the animal world makes meaning, and they do that in very specific ways. The example here of bees indicating to one another the distance to available pollen is one. But the general point, I suppose, of how animals mean is that they are enframed within a more or less static Umwelt. And this is Jacob Uexküll's term, of course, by which he meant to refer to a kind of a delimited context, a kind of relatively stable context. And I'm putting this up, of course, to contrast it with what it is that we do as humans, where we are able to do much more than communicate within the frame of our own Umwelt. Yeah, of course, human semiosis also includes gesture, kinesics, sounds, but we have language, we have inscription, we have tools, constructions, infrastructures, technologies, etc. And all these are kind of defining of homination, defining of how we as humans have evolved. And what is most interesting about that evolution is that we have shifted out of that more or less stable defining Umwelt into Welt, into what you could call a human world that we are shaping and reshaping as we go. Now, and here I'm drawing on some ideas put forward by Peter Sloterdijk, who's a German philosopher, and who I find fascinating in the way how he talks about human meaning making. He regards the spheres that we develop around us, the new ways of being together, as forms of co-immunity. And this is, of course, a play of words on community and communication. But that term immunity is absolutely critical here. This is less to do with information. Yeah, this is the critical point, and a lot to do with a belonging that provides a protective shield. And it is human effort that generates that shield. And that shield is made up of material semiotic resources that support, protect, perpetuate, and innovate varieties of human life. If you want to read up about this, then the reference to this particular essay that I'm really, I can really recommend, The Domestication of Being, the clarification of the clearing. The clearing is a Heideggerian term, and it is that notion of the sphere that we as humans are able to produce for and around ourselves in new ways. A fascinating essay. It's in this particular collection here. This is John Protevi, who also talks about Welt, but now in terms of niche. So the words Welt, niche, sphere, they all refer to this envelopment that we as humans have been able to play with. And he says, when our early hominin ancestors moved onto the plains, they encountered a highly variable environment necessitating collaboration. Counterintuitively, the world was too dangerous to afford competition, let alone war. We therefore evolve towards great plasticity of intelligent behavior. To the extent we engage in niche construction, we change our environment so that it could be inherited in predictable ways, but never so rigidly as to disallow cultural change. Now, Pratevi is very explicit about the centrality of violence to human coexistence. So there's a definite tension then between the niches that we're able to create together and the violence that occurs when a niche comes up against its own limits or comes up against the limits of other niches. But the main point then for Pratevi is that for any of this to occur, there has to be collaboration. There has to be this co-immunity, this sharedness. And whether you call that sharedness a niche or a sphere or meaning or discourse, it depends on whether your interests are more cognitive, where you might like to talk about meaning and discourse, or whether they're more material, in which case you might like to talk about niche and space and sphere. That's neither here nor there. The central point is that as humans, we build constructs around ourselves and each other. Now, I'd like to put some propositions to you to flesh out that idea that what happens at the edge of the niches, the spheres that we develop for us and among us, and why that is a particularly important issue to consider. I'll use the word meaning from here on, just to kind of make it a little bit simpler in how I talk about this. But for meaning as such to be apprehended as meaning, it needs to have come up against its limits. Now, I know that when we do discourse studies, we are primarily interested in the discourses that create particular ways of meaning about the world. I suppose what it is that I'm talking about here is when these discourses, these meanings come up against their limits and what happens beyond those limits. Meaning coming up against its own limits involves meaning gaining a profile against a background made up of what meaning is not. Right? So what we're talking about here is kind of the end of meaning. There's something happening here that is bigger than meaning, something that we haven't meant before. So meaning confronts its limits when it fails to represent the experiences that it is asked or tasked to represent. That is when meaning fails life. And I think we've seen this happen in recent years on a number of fronts. Yeah, we really struggle to understand what is happening with COVID. We really struggle to understand what's happening with Brexit. We struggle to understand even more what's happening in Ukraine. Now, this is where meaning fails life. And this, I suggest, introduces a dissonance between life and meaning. It can do this. It needn't for everyone. People may have set ways of dealing with the failure of meaning, where people fall back on established narratives about good and evil. But it may be that there is a deeper dissonance that arises here between meaning and life. We now realize there's more to life than meaning is able to accommodate. And this is the critical point, I suppose. This is a post-Kantian or a pre-Kantian perspective, in the sense that Kant regarded the human as a creature that was only able to apprehend life through the structures of its own cognitive abilities. We are now saying that these cognitive abilities can come up against their own limits and that there is more to the apprehension of life than the Kantian perspective. And I suggest that this dissonance, meaning coming up against its own limits, converts into energy, into excess energy, fear, anxiety, anger, and movement, change in meanings, practices, relationships as well, assumptions, understandings, explanations. And that this manifests as affect. And I suppose here is where I now jump off into a discussion of affect against the background of that idea that affect arises particularly when meaning comes up against its own limits. I've been interested in affect for quite a while, particularly when I was reading Brian Masumi, who's the translator of Deleuze and Guattari, of course, and who wrote a book in 2002 that I'll quote some from in a minute. But he talked about affect as a space of vitality, whereas everything else is the space of structure and predictability. Now, these are very simplistic oppositions. These are not things that we need to set too much store by, but it is an interesting jump-off point into thinking about affect as the energy that arises at that point where a niche or a sphere or a welt or or meaning comes up against its own limits. I don't know if you have personal experience of what I'm talking about, but if you've experienced grief, then you may have experience of not being able to mean. And it is that personal experience that I also draw in when I talk about these things. And I think that's probably a critical aspect of appreciating what we're talking about here. So if you think about the urge to mean, and I suppose that's what defines being human, we experience an urge to mean, to language about, which is the urge to maintain our circumstances, our wealth, our niche, our sphere. And there have been a number of people who've questioned that urge, to maintain the meanings that contextualize our lives, or that really structure our lives. One of these people is Heidegger, who saw that kind of assumption of meaning that we find around us as a lacking in authenticity. That is a lapsing into what he called the they. They represents all these available meanings that we find around us, the kind of available content, digested, pre-produced content around us. That is the they that we lapse into, and that can tranquilize us, that can make us, I suppose, unfeeling towards more urgent matters that are going on in life. And this was portrayed really powerfully by Samuel Beckett, of course, in his work, particularly in the Unnameable, or L'Innommable, French novel that he wrote about a person, a voice trying to achieve silence, its own silence, which proved to be impossible. And I think there's a link between Beckett's search for silence and the constant assault on the self by all these discourses that surround us, and Heidegger's work. And then, for these people, the question arises, is it ever possible to mean authentically? Is there any meaning that really arises directly from within our own personal direct experience of a spherical becoming? Now, that aside, I think the problem of meaninglessness, when our niche, when our sphere decomposes, because of a threat, because of a challenge, a crisis. What it does is not just raising the specter of meaninglessness, but it exposes meaning as not natural, neutral, and necessary. But it becomes then experienced, or potentially becomes experienced as normative, interested, and arbitrary. And it may direct us away from this tranquilizing familiarity of available meaning, yeah? And it may direct us towards finding new life, finding new meaning. And so there's a paradox here. Yeah? On the one hand, we have this capacity for confronting meaninglessness and creating new niches. At the same time, there is the imperative to be part of this co-immunity and to be able to produce meaning with others. I just want to pause there for a moment because I don't want to move too fast through this, and see if anybody wants to comment at this point. Okay, well, don't hesitate to stop me. But essentially now we've arrived at that point where we're conscious of a paradox. Yeah? On the one hand, humans have the capacity for creating new niches. They've got the capacity to leave their context of meaning and develop new contexts. But at the same time, humans find it impossible to live without meaning, without co-immunity. So there's that, I suppose, existential tension, yeah, that we experience as humans between knowing that we need not be where we are and at the same time needing to be where we are in a more meaningful way. And this, I should say, replays many of the ideas that I picked up from Sloterdijk, so this is by no means mine. And I'm also conscious that what I'm doing here is skating over a lot of thought, a lot of philosophy, and a lot of contributions from discourse, within discourse studies as well, where people have talked about these things. This is just fleshing out that notion of they, yeah, where they is the totality of available content. And Heidegger refers to this as a real dictatorship, which becomes tangible when we take pleasure and enjoy ourselves as they take pleasure. We find shocking what they find shocking, i.e. we give ourselves over to the judgments, the values, the norms held by other people. And we are unable to dissociate ourselves from those values and norms and come up with a more authentic way of being in the world. This is Bernard Stiegler, who says something similar, summarizing Heidegger. Everydayness is normalized, naturalized by the they. There are several dimensions of the they, which can be understood as the impersonal, which is the condition of what Heidegger himself calls the they. I have attempted elsewhere to characterize this as the dead. So the dead is what has already been, and what it is that we can subscribe to fairly easily by just accepting what other people have been saying. Now, when I was putting this talk together, I had this idea in my head that as discourse analysts interested in political discourse, one of the primary problems must be the difficulty of anchoring any kind of discourse to an authentic set of norms or values. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that because there's so much discoursing going on at the moment. And so my aim then, I suppose, that is underpinning what I'm doing here is to enable you to think about signing up to discourses as the problem in and for itself, whether that's the discourse of pro-Ukrainian politics, or anything else. I would like to draw back from all of that and to see if there is a different stance possible that we can take towards meaning per se, to obviate the kinds of problems that we get in what we're seeing in the contemporary world. If the available content that we find out there is dead, in Stiegler's terms, then the question becomes, well, what is life then? And here we are back with affect, or affective capacity. And the interest expressed here by Deleuze, who summarizes Spinoza, is in looking for the origin or the essence of life, which they define as not what we are, but what we can become. So this is not about defining what we are or what we say, what we do, but this is about looking at what we can become, what we can say, what we can do. So you will not define a body by its form, nor by its organs or functions, and neither will you define it as a substance or a subject. Every reader of Spinoza knows that for him, bodies and minds are not substances or subjects, but modes. And a mode is merely a capacity for affecting and being affected. So affect theory is very much preempted on that notion that we're not talking about objects and concrete things, but we're talking about capacities, about potentials. So if you define bodies and thoughts as capacities for affecting and being affected, you will define an animal or a human being not by its form, organs, or functions, and not as a subject. You'll define it by the affects of which it is capable. And the affects then are the capacities. This is then something that links into what Sloterdijk talks about as well, where he says that allowing oneself to be affected symbolizes the situation of all those who intervene in themselves through allowing others to intervene in them, which I find such a fascinating notion. Yeah? It gets away from drawing boundaries. It centralizes the point about the ability to become, the ability to be affected. I apologize here for my translation from the German, and I'm very conscious that people with much better German than my own may correct me, so I'll move on quick smart. But the other point then that Sloterdijk talks about is that being affected by others engenders a participation in other people's or in unfamiliar kinds of competencies. You know, and here we are beginning to talk about, well, how is it then possible to become other? How is it possible to capitalize on that capacity to become? And participating in other people's unfamiliar competencies is a critical aspect of that. And I'll link that into a research approach that I've been practicing for some time now, where I try to put this into practice. This is the German version. The English translation is absolutely terrible, and I hope there'll be a new one soon. Now, if you look at affect and the way it's talked about in relation to discourse, there's two different stances. On the one hand, we find Margaret Wetherell and people like Ruth Leiss and Emily Martin, for whom affect is a performative phenomenon. It's the logic of shared life. It is affective discursive, and we must avoid formulating affect as a kind of extra discursive and uncanny excess. So these are the people for whom affect is parallel to discourse. And this is an example of a girl who accuses another girl And Wetherill describes this as the moment of affect as involving her whole body and movements are intimately choreographed and patterned with her words. Her words and her body demonstrate her effective position and stance in the ongoing interaction. She's first a judge and then an accuser, and then a demonstrator of exactly what was wrong. This affective display is normatively organized as part of socially recognized routines or effective practices. For Wetherill, effective practice is a key term. And the term practice suggests a relatively systematized occurrence of activity, and affect is merely an aspect of those occurrences. And here are a couple of references that I draw on. On the other hand, then we see people who treat affect in a very different way. Kathy Carruth talks about traumatic experience beyond the psychological, beyond the psychological dimension of suffering, and it involves a certain paradox that the most direct seeing of a violent event may occur as an absolute inability to know it, an inability to mean it. Yeah? And the Holocaust, of course, in particular, is the watershed event of the modern age because uniquely terrible and unspeakable, it radically exceeds our capacity to grasp and understand it. Now, Ruth Leis is quite critical of Carruth, and Leis would side with Wetherill rather than with Carruth, saying that affect is mean and meanable, whereas for Carruth, affect has a dimension that denies meaning. So these are basically the two camps that do not really agree with one another. Then a few other people who talk about affect as something that moves us, affect as being beyond meaning. I draw on my own book that came out a couple of years ago, or a year ago now, where veering into meaninglessness, i.e. stepping beyond the boundaries of our niche, of our sphere, calls into question the dominance of meaning per se, or it can do this. It can lead to trauma, but it can lead to a questioning, a realization that there is more than meaning per se. It relativizes meaning. It may mitigate the urge to mean. And it attenuates, or may do so, our reliance on meaning as a source of identification, explanation, and argumentation. And I suppose this is an important point, politically speaking, in the sense that when we realize that we are not going to achieve truth through argumentation or explanation, but that truth may reside in that more distant background, beyond the niches that we are familiar with or that we can define for ourselves, we become capable of negotiating at a different level of existence. It creates more prominence for affect as an as yet not meant, but shareable ontological background and dynamic. And perhaps it relieves the fear of meaninglessness. And I suppose this is the point where it becomes important to note that meaningless now forms a critical step in our negotiation of events that we are unable to explain, and that we should not dismiss the absence of meaning as a problem, but we should see it as a route into a different way of negotiating how we go forward together, because it may challenge and transcend our capacity to mean and to be. And so here, meaninglessness and the affects that it generates become the space where we may be able to enhance our capacity to be and to act together. For Masumi, affect was a pre-personal intensity corresponding to the passage from one experiential state of the body to another and implying an augmentation in that body's capacity to act. Now, this is a Spinozan moment, an idea, in the sense that Spinoza also talks about positive affect as passing from a lesser perfection to a greater perfection. So for Spinoza, positive affect is potentiating the body's capacity to act. So the paradox here is that we're talking about meaningless and the edge of our niche, our sphere, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we're talking about potentiating the body, potentiating our capacity to be and to mean. And it is tricky to hold these two seemingly contradictory notions together. But when you then bring that down to earth at the level of what we're going to do research-wise, then it might look like something like this. In the first instance, of course, it's very difficult to dissociate ourselves from our world and make objective claims about that world. You know, that is something that we acknowledge. But at the same time, I suppose it should be noted that affect theory doesn't really push the implications of its own position to their logical conclusion in a methodological sense. So we don't really get many clues about how affect theory may now be instrumentalized or operationalized at a level of research. It's mostly a theoretical endeavor. Now, I would suggest that since affect refers to affective capacity, which manifests as movement, conventional object or knowledge focused research, which frames the world, may need to be complemented with capacity research, which focuses on generating, experimenting with changes in capacity. And there the key word is not knowledge, but potentiation. So I'm not trying to know the past, we're just trying to potentiate how we go forward. And an example of this, and I'm by no means suggesting that this is the only way to do this, but when you confront people with video footage of their own ways of being in the world, they become able to contemplate and deliberate about novel ways of going forward. We've done this in the area of infection control, for example. I just want to play you a quick clip. I hope I'm not going way over time. I'll do this very quickly and then conclude. This is a clip of some people who are moving an infected patient through an intensive care unit. And we're showing this back to these people, after which they are able to grasp the complexity of their own ways of being in the world in a very different way. And it's the different relationships that arise from these people talking about that world that we believe, and I think this has been shown in practice, these people are able to confront more complex circumstances than they were able to do before this particular intervention.
Well, if you prepare it before, like you clear out the space before you enter the room and something like that. But when you're actually moving with like an extra happening, like that age, if you look at the end, so it kind of breaks the movement. Because you see that this is extra machine just there.
This is the day when we had to actually move at least 4 patients and the musical beds because we found out as this gentleman had a rhinovirus that maybe had influenza, I think. Oh. So it was really busy that time. That's why probably as said, the whole unit is like chaos. So,
now this is an interesting turning point, because it's here that they begin to talk about, well, how can they now confront these situations instead?
Maybe you need to have somebody just so my responsibility is to walk ahead of them in the bed and run the limitations, like your body taken out of the way.
No, I mean, the specific suggestions here are neither here nor there, but it is noteworthy that these people are now beginning to be able to view their own practices from a different perspective and plan them in a very different way than they were able to do before. Now, we've done this in a range of different fields, in healthcare in particular, showing how people being able to engage with the complexity of their own ways of working and their own behaviors are able to deliberate about these things in ways that creates a different kind of intelligence for them to go forward. And I would suggest that, this is about creating a capacity to be different in the world. And this is that notion of potentiation that I referred to earlier. Written about this in a few different places, but I'd then like to conclude that, if you accept that affect is a critical focus for the modern world, then oh, sorry, that sentence doesn't make sense. Then research is less about capturing reality than it is about making things possible. So that then means too that research is less a fixed procedure that the researcher imposes on the world, but rather an eventful trajectory that we invent with the people that we are aiming to potentiate. And so this is about enhancing our own as researchers, but also others' capacity to act. And visualities is one of the things that shakes people out of their established niches and confronts them with the end, with the limits of their own ways of being in the world. And this can be threatening by all means, but it can also move people. People themselves have increasing experience with visuality, and people, I think too, may be more open now than perhaps they were in the past to the autotherapeutic potential of visual research. And I'd like to conclude there. I'm more than happy to flesh out some of the connections in the talk, because I'm now conscious that I've gone quite quickly in the end. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So does anyone have any questions? You can just raise your hand, or there's nothing in the chat. So if you want to ask your question, fire away. I think Martha has raised her hand.
Hi, good morning from Miami. This is almost 6 o'clock in the morning, so thank you for this wonderful and challenging talk that made me wake up this time in the morning. And I have several questions, very interesting. Thank you for this talk. And I would like to ask you, let me see where I start. Meaninglessness. Would you say that meaninglessness can also be thought of as new meaning or creating meaning? Meaninglessness has to be meaningful for some people in order to become something. That's one question. The other one is, I would like you to elaborate a little bit more about visuality and research. How do you explain that a little bit more to understand? Does it mean multimodality, or what kind of visuality we are talking about in research methodology? Thank you very much for explaining all this.
Thanks, Martha. I suppose you're right. When I talk about meaninglessness, it's merely a way of saying that it is a phenomenon that pushes us to develop meaning, given our urge to mean and to encapsulate the not yet meant within meaning. The meaninglessness is nothing else than the impetus for us to mean. I'd just like to emphasize, though, the affective intensity of meaninglessness. And I say this, from a personal perspective, but also from a political perspective, because meaninglessness is something that challenges us. Yeah, it's something that we find very difficult to manage. We find it very difficult to be not within meaning. Visuality is whichever way you'd like to take it, really, but I think the reflection that people encounter when they see their own lives is a powerful one, and that can be done through screens, it can be done through theatre. I've done work with playwrights and actors, and so there's different ways for us to re-experience how we are in the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, does this answer your question, Martha? Okay, I think Chelsea was next, and we've got a question by Johannes as well, and then we have a few questions in the chat. So Chelsea, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Professor. It's a very inspiring talk, but I think it's a little bit difficult for me. I wish I would have the chance to see this recording again. But basically, I have a very basic question. How would you distinguish emotion from affect? My second question is also about the visual research. I think just now one of the participants has asked you about visual research. By visual research, are you referring to multimodal research, or actually you are saying that any research that make the people be visualized could be characterized as such kind of research? Yeah, and the other thing is that I really want to know more about therapeutic potential, because I'm now doing online depression narratives on online communities, and I'm now considering whether it's possible that the people will have such kind of influence, like therapeutic potential for their own mental illness. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chelsea. The distinction between emotion and affect is one that was drawn by Antonio Damasio and Brian Masumi as well, where affect is that more general pre-personal energy, where emotion is the more personal or the personalized dimensions of affect. So if there is a lot of energy out in the street, I go out in the street and it may make me feel anxious. Then my anxiety is the emotion, whereas the energy in the street is the affect. That's the way I tend to think about that. Excuse me. Multimodality is a form of analysis of discursive objects. And yeah, when I talk about visuality, I tend to link that to the work that we've done using video and involving people in looking at the videos of their own living circumstances and their own working contexts. And that's not done with the intent to analyze from a multimodal perspective. It is done with the intent to enable people to capitalize on their potential to become more than what they are, or to become different from what they are. So multimodality likes to take something as an object and explain its structure. What I'm talking about when I talk about potentiation, I'm talking about people being enabled to become more than what they are. Your third point I wasn't quite clear about, Chelsea. You must forgive me. I wasn't able to understand your question there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just want you to explain more about the auto-therapeutic potential. I mean, you know, therapeutic is something like treatment or healing, right? So because now my research is about depression. So, but it's the background is the background is about its own online community. So I just want to know about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it possible for people to get self healed via this auto therapeutic? Yeah.
Well, exactly. You know, and I think we don't really experiment with that sufficiently. If we put people in groups and facilitate those groups in ways that capitalize on people's potential to become more. And of course, there's multiple ways in which we are doing that. I'm not discrediting any of those ways, but that essentially is capitalizing on the autotherapeutic potential that people carry within themselves when they're in a safe space. So yeah, I totally believe in the importance of that as a research technology.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Chelsea. Okay, I'm just going to ask a question from the chat that was posted 6 minutes ago by Davide. Davide, would you like me to read it out, or would you like to ask your question with the mic on? If you're still here.
You can read it out. Hi, Rick.
Shall I just read?
Hi, David. Sorry.
Hi, so the question is, what are the relationships between this view and the idea of negative capability, for example, as used by Beyond and many others? Would you need, that's the question, would you need any elaboration on this view, or would you like me to read it out again?
I'm not quite sure what is meant by negative capability, I'm sorry.
Okay. Davide, could you elaborate?
Yes, so negative capability is a concept introduced by Keats in 1700s, where he was describing the capacity of poetry to help to face the unknown, the darkness. And it's been used by a variety of authors to describe the capacity to steer into what we call meaninglessness as a place to generate new meaning, to take new course of actions. Beyond, who was a famous British psychiatrist, used to say that this is where good psychotherapists should hold back from imposing meaning in order to give time for new interpretations to happen. So it's the risk of just getting to closure very often. I was just wondering if Rick had encountered this, because there's all traditions of this, even in interventionist research.
Yeah, that's interesting, David, and thanks for raising that. Very vaguely now, there's some bells ringing in the back of my head about this, but essentially, I suppose, if I understand you correctly, the point of it is that you don't impose explanations on what it is you're dealing with, but you're allowing deliberation to produce understandings that people are creating from the immediate life circumstances that they are experiencing. So these are not expert-based or theoretical labels for what it is that's going on. This is people from a direct experience of the living circumstances producing ways of understanding, ways of relating, and ways of moving forward. Thank you for the link. That's a great connection.
Thank you very much. I have one more question in the chat, and then we've got 2 more raised hands. This question is from Bella. I'm just going to read it out. Thank you, Professor Iedema. I don't know whether I understood it correctly. Did you mean that effect is more of a theory guiding us to do qualitative research in the field of discourse analysis rather than a methodology? And could you explain more about the main differences between effective practice and effective capacity?
Yeah, a great question. You know, I don't think that affect theory as such produces a program of research. I think affect is more to do with the specific limits that we encounter when discourse becomes unable to explain life. And so this is less about describing discourses than it's about describing the senescence, yeah, the breaking apart of discourses in the face of circumstances that are bigger than it. The second point there was about the difference between affective practice and affective capacity. For some people, affect is always already social, always already constituted in meaning. So as a therapist, you can look at a highly emotional patient and be able to analyze and understand and explain the kinds of things that are going on for that patient. For the patient, him or herself, the experience may be steeped in meaninglessness, may be steeped in terror, may be steeped in phenomena that are unable to be discursified as yet. And so taking a discursive or an affective practice perspective means to assume that there is an explanation for the kinds of feelings and affects that constitute life. If we look at this from the other angle, from affective capacity, we become aware that as individuals experience the limits of meaning, they become capable of perhaps contemplating the possibility of new ways of being. And I think that is a critical perspective, and it's not something that's too individual for us to ignore as researchers. I think, on the contrary, that is becoming a critical field of investigation, particularly because of the rising uncertainty of contemporary life and all these different things like COVID and Brexit and war and everything that are beginning to bear down on us and that are beginning to affect us personally. And that we as researchers really need to turn our attention to for us to contribute to the modern world in ways that are potentiating.
Thank you. Okay, Johannes, you've been waiting patiently. And then I'll go one more.
Yeah, great to listen to you and to learn about your current work. I also wonder how to study affect in discourse. I understand it's a property of discursive dynamics, of discursive phenomena. And I wonder whether this means a return back to hermeneutics as a personal art of understanding, of developing a holistic idea of the world and of life. And what would you think about the limits and the problems with hermeneutics, if that's the route that you would take?
Thank you, Johannes, for that question. And I appreciate, the dilemma that we have here. I suppose when you talk about hermeneutics, you're talking about a strategy that was applied to a text, the Bible originally. I think the affect theory has arisen in contemporary times precisely because that object that we are trying to understand is no longer biblical, right? It is increasingly fluid and it is increasingly all over the shop. Social media is everywhere. It's constantly changing. It's viral. And so the almost comfortable position that a hermeneut can take in relation to a relatively static object is one that we are almost no longer able to deploy in relation to the chaotic developments that we witness around us. And I suppose that's why I'm talking about research needing to shift from the observer analyst to the person who is able to work with capacities and potentiate people within situations through enabling them to come up with interpretations, to enabling them to become the hermeneutes of their own situations, their own lives, and that we need to come up with methods for enabling people to do so. Video is one way of doing that, I've found, but there may be lots of other ways for people to do that. So we become players within social situations rather than observers who operate at a distance from the objects that we're interested in.
So you'd be quite critical of the idea of empirical discourse research as the kind of objectifying stance of an observer towards others. And would you say this is? I mean, this is psychoanalytical, right? As opposed to you would intervene in discourses so that people activate others and themselves to change their position and to change discourse in ways which is more healthy. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, but please don't misunderstand me. I think there's absolute value in people analyzing the discourses of war, for example, coming out of Russia and the nonsense that all that represents. There's absolute value in people being able to objectify positions that people are taking up. That has value. But I think in the contemporary world, it is becoming increasingly necessary for us to also engage in situations with players in ways that enhance those players' capacity to be and to act in their own contexts. And I'm particularly thinking, I suppose, about, well, if you want to take the Ukrainian situation here, what is there for researchers like us that we can do to capacitate and potentiate people in these situations, rather than merely analyze the discourses that are constituting the conflict? I don't have the answer to this, but I'm just posing the question as a way of kind of throwing things up in the air and giving us a greater energy to think about what is now possible for us to do with and for the Ukrainians, for example.
Sure, thanks.
Thanks very much. And we've got another raised hand. Thank you so much for your patience. Lyubov, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Rick, for a very fascinating talk. It's very interesting for me, and I would say that we are on the same wave with you. And I've been thinking about this notion, but in other terms. It concerns not meaninglessness, but I'm thinking about wrong references, and I associate your term with my understanding of wrong references. When, for instance, the people deal with unknown objects, we cannot adjust it to some existing and actual models, mental models. So they try to find something similar, but not exact, because we haven't faced this phenomenon yet. For instance, if to take the phenomenon of COVID-19 or Russian-Ukrainian conflict and others. So, and perhaps we deal with such a phenomenon of wrong references when we can't understand what is going on, and we try to find some appropriate model. That's why we deal another phenomenon in society. So this is absolutely contradictory references to the same objects, real objects and phenomena. So that's why we can't understand each other and we can't explain what is going on, because we have different options to determine one and the same thing. That's it. So this is my idea. It's not a question. Or maybe you comment. You'll comment on the just how they can be compared to those terms: meaningless, meaninglessness, and wrong references. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lyubov. I mean, the critical problem, I suppose, is that when people radically disagree on versions of reality, I suppose I was trying to get around that particular kind of disagreement by saying, if you allow for that kind of disagreement to mean that there is a limit to meaning, then it becomes possible for us to perhaps agree that there is a different ontological reality, which is, that we both face the limits of our own discourses or meanings, where we are able to connect in a different way. Now, all this may sound a bit utopian and a bit naive, perhaps, but at the moment, I don't see any other way through this, because establishing superior argumentation doesn't seem to be something that is working in the present context. I may not have understood your point, but that's kind of my gut reaction to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have another quick question by Georgina that she posted in the chat. She says, really awesome, thank you. And this relates directly to both my PhD research as well as my work as trauma therapist. I would love to know more about your research approach and wonder if you had some useful readings or references where I can learn more. Thank you.
Yeah, I can send through my slides, and there's some references in the slides that people can follow up.
Thank you. And we have one last question. And by the way, Georgina, we will upload the talk to our channel. So if you want to check the slides there, they will obviously be part of the recording, and the references are at the bottom of the slides. You should be able to see them there as well. And one last question by Hasim. If you want to go ahead and ask a question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and fantastic talk. I don't know whether I understood the whole talk, and I'll go to the recording. But I'm also quite intrigued by this idea of meaninglessness. And when we endow meaning to it, to this meaninglessness. So I'm just wondering that meaninglessness will lose meaning, and if it's when and we'll fall back onto our own the older being. So when we talk of this enhancing the capacities, I'm just wondering that is it possible to enhance our capacity to the extent that we live comfortably with meaninglessness?
Lovely point. Yeah, I agree. I think meaninglessness is an absolutely critical dimension of the healthy being. It is as if meaninglessness relieves us of that dominance of meaning in our lives, and that we can pay attention to something that is not meaning. So you're absolutely right. And here, of course, we're talking about some concepts that are quite religious in nature, where people pursuing silence as a way of getting beyond semiosis, beyond language, And this was Samuel Beckett's aim. He wanted to achieve silence. He wanted to silence all the voices going on around him and in his head. So you're absolutely right that meaninglessness becomes almost our aim, because that is the point where we're all in it together as humans. You know, that's where we meet. The rest is Babel, the rest is argumentation.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for staying with us 20 minutes longer and for asking all of these questions. And thank you so much to Rick as well. I'm just going to stop the recording.